It was a picture-perfect family, the kind that people looked up to, admired, and envied from afar. To the public, the Murdaugh family of South Carolina was a beacon of power, wealth, and influence. But behind the polished image of privilege and prestige, there were secrets, dark secrets, that no one could have ever imagined. On June 7th, 2021, Alex Murdaugh, the scion of this once revered family, would make a phone call that would shatter the legacy his forefathers had built. A call that would unravel a life built on lies, manipulation, and betrayal. Alex, frantic and breathless, would tell the 911 operator, "My wife and son were just shot badly." His voice trembled with emotion, but little did anyone know, the truth was much darker than he could ever express. His wife Maggie and their son Paul were found dead near the family's dog kennels on their sprawling estate in Moselle, South Carolina. The horror that followed was not just the brutal killings of two beloved family members, but the slow, agonizing unraveling of a dynasty built on generations of legal authority, community power, and wealth. The Murdaughs, for decades, had been a fixture in the South Carolina legal landscape. But as the investigation into the murders unfolded, what was meant to remain hidden in the shadows of the family's high-profile status came to light. A series of financial crimes, family betrayal, opioid addiction, and a host of other unsettling truths would soon be exposed, including other mysterious deaths connected to the family, like that of their housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, in 2018, and of a local teenager, Stephen Smith, in 2015. These events painted a picture far removed from the pristine image the Murdaughs had long cultivated. The story of the Murdaugh family begins long before that fateful night in June. In the heart of South Carolina's Low Country, the Murdaugh name was synonymous with power. Alex's great-grandfather, grandfather, and father had each served as solicitors in the 14th Judicial Circuit, overseeing 5 counties for nearly a century. This position meant the Murdaughs had enormous sway over the local legal system, the police, and even the people. The family wasn't just powerful, they were untouchable. But as time went on, Alex Murdaugh's once revered position began to erode. Behind the scenes, cracks had started to appear. The pressure to maintain his family's legacy weighed heavily on Alex. And as it did, so did his desperation. For years, Alex had lived a double life. On one side, he was the respected lawyer, the heir to a dynasty. On the other, he was a man battling a growing opioid addiction and a crumbling marriage. His public facade was one of success, but privately, his life was unraveling. Maggie, his wife of over 2 decades, had long been a pillar of support. She was not just a mother to their 2 sons, Buster and Paul, but the emotional anchor that kept the family together. Despite the outward appearance of a perfect family, Maggie had begun to see the cracks in Alex's behavior. She had confided in friends that Alex's increasingly erratic behavior, his opioid use, and the mounting pressure from his financial troubles had begun to strain their relationship. It's hard to reconcile the image of the Murdaugh family, wealthy, respected, and powerful, with the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface. Maggie's growing concerns about Alex's behavior were real. And that evening, in June 2021, as Alex called her to meet at Moselle, the tensions between them reached a breaking point. Maggie knew something was wrong. In a text to a friend, she said her husband sounded fishy and was up to something. In her final moments, her fears were confirmed. Her husband's world, built on a fragile foundation of lies, was about to come crashing down. Maggie's murder, alongside the death of their 22-year-old son Paul, would set off a series of events that no one could have predicted. The community, once enamored with the Murdaugh family, would soon be forced to reckon with the truth. Alex Murdaugh, the man they once trusted, was hiding far more than just an opioid addiction. The investigation into Maggie and Paul's deaths was immediate, but not without complications. Alex's behavior, both in the aftermath of the murders and during the investigation, was erratic. He repeatedly lied to authorities about his whereabouts that night. His alibi shifted with each new statement, and the more the investigators dug, the more suspicious his actions appeared. Then came the most damning evidence of all, a video taken by Paul just minutes before his death. At 8:44 p.m., Paul had recorded a video from the family's dog kennels, showing the family dogs.
He's got a bird in his mouth.
Bubba. Hey, Bubba.
It's a guinea.
This is a chicken.
Come here, Bubba.
Come here, Cash.
Come here, Bubba.
Cash. Quick.
In the background, the voices of Maggie and Alex could be clearly heard. This contradicted Alex's claim that he had been at his mother's house at the time of the killings. The footage would later become a pivotal piece of evidence that would play a crucial role in his conviction. The more the investigation unfolded, the more disturbing the picture became. It was revealed that Alex had stolen millions of dollars from his own clients over the years, committing financial fraud on a staggering scale. His once respected law firm was reeling from the fallout of his actions. Alex's opioid addiction had led him down a path of lies and manipulation. But nothing compared to the shocking discovery that he had orchestrated the murders of his wife and son. But why? What would drive a man to murder the very people closest to him? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, a tragic and complex story emerged. Alex had been under immense pressure. His financial crimes were on the verge of being exposed, and a looming hearing over his son Paul's involvement in a deadly boat crash was set to open just days after the murders. The case surrounding the boat crash had already threatened to unravel Alex's life, but it was the fear of complete ruin, the loss of his legacy, his power, his wealth, that drove him to take the most extreme step. The murder of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh is a tragedy that goes far beyond just the loss of two lives. It's a story of a family destroyed by greed, addiction, and lies. Alex Murdaugh's actions not only shattered his family, but also caused irreparable damage to a community that had placed its trust in the Murdaugh name for generations. The emotional cost of his crimes is felt deeply by those left behind. His surviving son, Buster, who now lives in the shadow of his father's actions, and the families of those who lost millions due to his financial deceit. The story of Alex Murdaugh and his family is not just one of murder and crime. It's a story of a dynasty built on lies, and how those lies ultimately consumed the very people who tried to protect it. The Murdaugh family's fall from grace is a reminder that no matter how powerful or untouchable someone may seem, the truth has a way of revealing itself. And when it does, it can tear down even the most well-guarded empires. It was an early summer evening, the kind that was supposed to be filled with the familiar sounds of crickets chirping and the rustling of wind through the trees on the Murdaugh family's sprawling 1,770-acre estate in Moselle, South Carolina. But on June 7th, 2021, that stillness was shattered. By 10:06 p.m., Alex Murdaugh had called 911, claiming he'd just arrived home to find the lifeless bodies of his wife, Maggie, and son, Paul, lying near the family's dog kennels.
I don't know the exact time, but I left. I was probably gone an hour and a half from my mom's, and I saw them about 45 minutes before that.
My wife and son were just shot badly. Alex's voice trembled as he spoke to the dispatcher. The distress in his voice was palpable, but it was a distress that would soon turn into something else. A hollow, desperate attempt to cover up a shocking truth. The narrative Alex spun for law enforcement seemed straightforward. He had been at his mother's house, taking care of her due to her Alzheimer's, and when he returned, he found his family murdered. But the question echoed through the investigation. Was that truly what happened? Or was it another lie, buried beneath a decades-long history of deception? As Alex spoke with the dispatcher, the pain in his voice was real, but it didn't match the overwhelming suspicion beginning to take root in the minds of investigators. In those first frantic moments, the truth began to slip, an unraveling thread that Alex wouldn't be able to keep intact for much longer. Sergeant Daniel Green of the Colleton County Sheriff's Office was the first to arrive at the scene, and what he found was far from what Alex's story had suggested. There, near the kennels, lay the bodies of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, the blood still fresh. The crime scene was chaotic, as if something had gone horribly wrong just moments before the responders arrived. The defense would later argue that the scene was hopelessly compromised, pointing out that intermittent rain fell before evidence was fully processed, and that more than a dozen family members and friends were allowed to walk through the area. Alex's behavior stood out almost immediately. He was agitated, yet strangely detached. A man who had supposedly just discovered the bodies of his wife and son, but was more concerned with his own alibi than the devastation around him. There was something unsettling about Alex's response to the questions of the officers. His story didn't line up. The details didn't make sense. How could he have not heard the shots? Why didn't he rush to his family's side sooner? And why was he so eager to leave the scene to visit his mother? These questions hung in the air like an unspoken weight. As investigators walked through the scene, they felt the tension thickening with every moment. Something about this tragedy didn't fit with the man standing before them. But they had to be careful. Alex Murdaugh, with his polished image and decades of family history, was not someone to be dismissed lightly. There was no room for error. And the more they asked, the more things didn't add up.
He's got a bird in his mouth.
Pain, Bubba.
It's a guinea.
This is a chicken. Come here, Cash. Cash. Quick.
A breakthrough. The video from Paul's phone. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Paul's phone. In the aftermath of the murders, investigators seized the phone and began combing through it. What they found would unravel Alex's carefully constructed alibi. At 8:44 p.m., just minutes before he and Maggie were killed, Paul had recorded a video from the family's dog kennels. In the background, 3 voices could be heard: Paul's, Maggie's, and Alex's. The unmistakable sound of Alex's voice was clearly audible, contradicting his earlier statement that he had been nowhere near the property when the murders occurred. The video was damning. It placed Alex at the crime scene, right before the time the murders were believed to have taken place. There was no denying it. The very evidence Alex had failed to account for was now staring him in the face. He couldn't erase the sounds of his own voice. Forensic revelations, the murder weapon, and the brutality. The forensic evidence only deepened the suspicion. Dr. Ellen Reamer, the forensic pathologist who conducted the autopsies on Maggie and Paul, would provide a chilling, methodical breakdown of their deaths. Paul had been struck twice by a shotgun. The first shot, entering his chest, was not immediately fatal. But the second shot was devastating. A near-contact wound that entered Paul's left shoulder, traveled up through his neck, and severed his brain from his spinal cord. The force was so extreme that Paul's brain was ejected from his skull. There were no defensive wounds, indicating that Paul had been caught off guard, his life taken in an instant. He had been defenseless. It was brutal, calculated violence. Maggie's wounds were no less horrific. She had been shot 4 or 5 times with a .300 blackout assault-style rifle. Some of the shots had been fired while she was still standing, but at least 2 were fired after she had fallen, consistent with an execution-style killing. There was no doubt about it. The deaths were deliberate, not random. The choice of weapons, the number of shots, the precision of the attacks. It all pointed to a level of anger and finality that couldn't be ignored. Someone with a clear intent had ended Maggie and Paul's lives. The strain of lies. By now, investigators were beginning to see Alex's behavior through a different lens. His alibi, his insistence that he had been with his mother, was growing increasingly shaky. The timeline, pieced together from phone records and witness testimony, didn't match the story he was telling. Data from Alex's phone showed a sudden burst of activity right before he left for his mother's house, recording 283 steps in just 4 minutes when he claimed to have been napping. GPS data from his SUV also showed him driving at speeds up to 80 miles per hour, far faster than his usual pace on that route, suggesting a desperate haste to create an alibi.
It's Alzheimer's and my dad is in the hospital. Okay. I left, I don't know what time. I can go back on my phone and tell you the exact...
When Alex was questioned further about his whereabouts on the night of the murders, his story kept shifting. The lies piled on top of one another. First, it was that he had been napping at home. Then, it was that he had gone to visit his mother, some 20 minutes away. But each story didn't fit the hard evidence. His car, his phone, the phone of his wife and son. Each piece of data told a story that Alex's words couldn't reconcile. By now, Alex's behavior was becoming more erratic. He wasn't just lying to investigators, he was attempting to manipulate the narrative, molding the facts to fit his version of events. This desperation culminated in a bizarre roadside incident 3 months after the murders. On September 4th, 2021, Alex was found with a superficial gunshot wound to the head, which he initially claimed was from a drive-by shooting. Days later, he confessed to orchestrating the entire event, admitting he had hired a distant cousin, Curtis Eddie Smith, to kill him, so his surviving son Buster could collect a $10 million life insurance policy. What would drive a man to lie so blatantly about something so serious? Could he really have killed his wife and son to cover up his financial crimes? The more they dug, the more the investigators began to believe that Alex's crimes went far beyond just money. His deceit ran deeper, and it seemed as though he had been living a life of complete moral corruption, covering up one lie after another, one crime after another. A family shattered. For those who knew Maggie and Paul, the horror of their deaths was compounded by the realization that the very man they had trusted most was likely responsible for taking their lives. Maggie, once so devoted to her family, had been betrayed in the most unimaginable way. Paul, too, had been betrayed by the very person who was supposed to protect him. In the courtroom, the emotional toll of these realizations was heavy. For those who had witnessed the Murdaugh family's fall from grace, it was as though the community's collective trust in Alex Murdaugh had been shattered in an instant. He had been one of their own, someone they had relied on for years. The shock of his involvement in the murders felt like a betrayal that reached to the very core of the community. But what was the true motive behind the murders? As the investigation continued, a deeper and darker picture began to form. Alex Murdaugh wasn't just facing the loss of his wife and son. He was facing the collapse of everything he had built. Years of financial fraud, hidden behind layers of deception, had begun to surface. He had stolen over $4.3 million in insurance settlements from the sons of his deceased housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, funneling the money into a fraudulent bank account he had created under the name Forge. Maggie and Paul's deaths, it seemed, had been part of a larger, twisted plan to distract from the growing financial turmoil in Alex's life. With the boat crash lawsuit set to bring attention to Paul's involvement in the 2019 accident, and Alex's financial crimes threatening to ruin him, the murder of his wife and son could have been his last, desperate attempt to protect everything he had worked for. In the end, his world wasn't just falling apart. It had already collapsed, and he had no way of stopping it. The truth comes crashing down. In the end, the investigation revealed a truth so dark, so twisted, that no one could have imagined it. Alex Murdaugh had committed the ultimate betrayal, not just of his family, but of everything he had once stood for. The brutal murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh were not random acts of violence. They were the final, devastating result of years of lies, financial schemes, and addiction. As the investigation drew to a close, Alex's fate was sealed. The truth, irrefutable and overwhelming, had come to light. There was no more room for manipulation, no more room for lies. And with that, the legacy of the Murdaugh family was forever tarnished. The murders of Maggie and Paul were not just a family tragedy. They were the result of a man who had built his life on lies, who had destroyed everything he held dear to protect a world that had been built on deceit. The full extent of Alex Murdaugh's actions was still being revealed, but one thing was certain. The truth had finally come out, and there was no going back. In a courtroom, everything is exposed. The truth, however ugly or painful, is forced into the light. And for Alex Murdaugh, the man who once controlled the law, this would be a battle he could no longer manipulate. On January 25th, 2023, the courtroom doors opened, and the nation watched in rapt attention as the case of the century began. Alex, once a pillar of his community, now stood in the defendant's chair, his fate in the hands of 12 jurors, the weight of 2 murdered lives on his conscience. This was the moment of reckoning, where a dynasty built on decades of privilege and power would finally crumble. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the trial of Alex Murdaugh unfolded. What began as a high-profile double homicide soon revealed itself to be something much darker. A tragedy fueled by greed, addiction, and a man willing to destroy his family to protect the very empire he had created. Alex's face, once familiar to so many, was now a mask, stoic, unreadable. He had nothing left to protect but his own skin. The facade of the Murdaugh family had shattered, and with each passing day, the courtroom became a stage for the public to witness the slow, inevitable collapse of a man who had lived a life of lies. The prosecution wasted no time in framing their case. Crichton Waters, the lead prosecutor, opened with a stark declaration. This wasn't just a double murder. This was a story of a man who had killed to cover up a lifetime of criminal behavior. He was no longer just a grieving husband and father. He was a man who had chosen murder to escape accountability. The evidence will show that Alex Murdaugh murdered his wife and son to cover up his financial crimes. And as a result, Maggie and Paul paid with their lives. Waters stated, his voice unwavering. The words hung heavy in the air. Dick Harputlian, Alex's defense attorney, responded with the only narrative he could muster: that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and speculation. There was no direct proof, he argued. No one had seen Alex pull the trigger. Yet, there was an undeniable weight to the prosecution's claims. The defense could only spin theories. The evidence was already overwhelming, and no one in that courtroom, not even Alex, could deny it. The video. The breakthrough came early. Paul Murdaugh's cell phone video, taken just minutes before his death, would become the cornerstone of the case.
Hey, he's got a bird in his mouth.
Hey, Bubba.
It's a guinea.
This is a chicken.
Come here, Bubba.
Come here, Cash.
Come here, Bubba.
Cash.
Hey, he's got
There was a
bird in his
chilling
mouth.
and damning piece of evidence.
Hey, Bubba.
In the video,
It's a guinea.
Paul, at the family's dog kennels, can be heard narrating the moment while his mother and father's voices are clearly audible in the background. Alex had told investigators that he wasn't at the estate that night.
I left. I was probably gone an hour and a half from my mom's, and I saw them about 45 minutes.
He said he had been with his mother, who suffered from Alzheimer's. But the video placed him at the scene. There was no denying it. His voice, unmistakable and clear, contradicted every word he had spoken. The evidence didn't just expose his lies, it shattered his credibility. The courtroom was silent as the video played. Alex, who had once manipulated the truth with ease, now had nowhere to hide. The video was a bombshell, a clear contradiction to the story he had maintained for nearly 2 years. The jury, listening intently, could not ignore it. His defense, based on a fabricated alibi, was crumbling with every passing second. As the prosecution presented its case, the layers of Alex's deceit began to unfold. One by one, witnesses took the stand to piece together the narrative of a man who had betrayed not only his family, but his community. 2 of Alex's former law partners detailed the alarming financial situation Alex had been hiding. He had stolen millions from clients, using his position to embezzle funds and hide his mounting debt. The legal empire the Murdaughs had built wasn't just crumbling. It was a facade, a house of cards built on lies. One of the most devastating testimonies came from John Seckinger, the former CFO of Alex's law firm. She testified about Alex's theft and the secretive nature of his financial dealings. She explained how Alex had manipulated her trust and taken advantage of the firm's resources to cover up his personal financial mess. She recalled the moment she confronted Alex about $792,000 in missing fees on the very morning of the murders, and her voice trembled as she described it. It was clear. The Murdaughs weren't just a family in crisis. They were a family built on corruption. The most anticipated moment of the trial came when Alex Murdaugh himself took the stand.
That I care about each one of you. Because I do. I did terrible things. Each of you placed your trust.
It was his chance to defend his actions, to present his side of the story. But his testimony did little to help his case. In fact, it only deepened the hole he had dug for himself. Alex admitted that he had lied about his whereabouts the night of the murders. The explanation he offered was almost as tragic as it was implausible. He was battling an opioid addiction, and his lies had been the result of paranoid thinking. His addiction, he claimed, clouded his judgment, leading him to lie to investigators and, in turn, destroy his family. "I didn't shoot my wife or son," he said, his voice shaky, his eyes filling with tears. But his emotional breakdown felt more like an act than a moment of genuine remorse. His attempts to explain away his lies only seemed to confirm the prosecution's case, that Alex's desperation had led him to betray those closest to him. But the more Alex spoke, the more it became evident that he wasn't just lying to law enforcement. He had been lying to himself for years. His addiction to drugs had spiraled out of control, but it was his financial crimes and the pressure to maintain the Murdaugh legacy that had driven him to murder. This wasn't just about addiction. It was about self-preservation. Alex had murdered his wife and son to protect himself from the consequences of his own actions. As the trial reached its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a final, powerful closing argument. Crichton Waters, his voice filled with moral conviction, reminded the jury of the cost of Alex's actions. "He fooled Maggie and Paul too," Waters said, "and they paid for it with their lives. Don't let him fool you too." The defense, in contrast, attempted to humanize Alex. Harpootlian painted him as a man who had been overtaken by his addiction, a man who had made terrible mistakes but wasn't capable of murder. He argued that Alex's lies, while tragic, didn't necessarily equate to guilt. But it was a defense that failed to connect with the jury. The evidence was too strong and the truth too overwhelming. Alex Murdaugh wasn't just a man with a drug problem. He was a man who had killed to protect the life he had built. The closing arguments were more than just a plea for justice. They were an indictment of everything Alex had become, a man who had built his life on lies and was willing to destroy everything to protect it. On March 2nd, 2023, after just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Alex Murdaugh was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during a violent crime. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read aloud. Alex's face, once a picture of confidence, now seemed hollow. His family, once a symbol of power and prestige, had been shattered. The man who had once been untouchable was now a convicted murderer. Judge Clifton Newman wasted no time in addressing the court. "The evidence of guilt is overwhelming," he stated, making it clear that the case against Alex was irrefutable. For Alex, the justice he had so often wielded against others was now being served upon him. On March 3rd, 2023, Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Judge Newman's words were final. The family that had once held South Carolina in its grip had now been completely undone. Alex Murdaugh's sentencing was the final chapter in a tragedy that had started long before the murders of Maggie and Paul. In the end, Alex Murdaugh was not just guilty of killing his wife and son. He was guilty of destroying everything that his family had worked for, everything they had stood for. His lies, his deceit, and his desperate attempt to maintain control had led to the murder of the people who had trusted him most. And now, as Alex Murdaugh sat in a prison cell, the legacy of the Murdaugh family lay in ruins. The story did not end when the prison doors closed on Alex Murdaugh. In a stunning post-trial twist, the very integrity of the verdict was called into question. Murdaugh's defense team filed an appeal based on explosive allegations of jury tampering against the Colleton County Clerk of Court, Rebecca "Becky" Hill. They accused Hill of making improper comments to jurors, pressuring them to reach a guilty verdict quickly, and telling them not to be fooled by Alex's testimony. The defense argued her motive was personal gain. She was co-authoring a book about the trial and believed a guilty verdict would boost sales. During a special hearing to consider the claims, the presiding judge, John Toll, found Hill was not a credible witness and had been attracted by the siren call of celebrity. Despite this, she ultimately denied the motion for a new trial, ruling that the defense had not proven Hill's comments directly caused any juror to change their vote. But the saga took another turn. Following a separate state investigation into her conduct, Becky Hill resigned from her position in March 2024 and was arrested in May 2025. She was indicted on multiple felony charges, including perjury for lying under oath during the tampering hearing and misconduct in office. These developments have breathed new life into Alex Murdaugh's appeal, which is now before the South Carolina Supreme Court. The legal battle has shifted from a question of his guilt to a question of the judicial process itself, ensuring that the fall of the House of Murdaugh remains a complex and ongoing American tragedy.